I just don't have any more room. So, as you can see, my study at home here is chock-a-block really. And this is where I do all of my videos and everything, but also it's where I conduct my Zoom calls because, of course, all of my clinical work now is done via Zoom. I give up my office after 15 months of not using it, so I just carried on with Zoom and it works pretty well. Now, this journal has in it an interesting study which I think is worth thinking about. So 22 years ago, this was published in January 2000. January 2000. And it is a study of an investigation of the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder on physical health. And so it benefits from having the military involved. People who came back from the Gulf War in 1999 were surveyed as part of the Fort Devens reunion survey. And so they were asked questions about post-traumatic stress disorder. And it turns out about 16.3% of the women in the survey had symptoms of post-traumatic stress or PTSD, and 12.8% of the men. Now, 2 years later, they asked them what kind of physical problems they had. And interestingly, women tend to have more physical problems than men, but the most commonly endorsed problem was headaches. 18% of men and nearly 40% of women had headaches. Aches and pains, 22% of men, 30% of women. Upset stomach, 12.5% of men, 18% of women. Trembling, so on and so forth. Dizziness, 3.7% of men, 7.8% of women. So way back in the 1900s and the early 2000s, it was kind of like a heyday for research into PTSD. Lots of what we might think of as epidemiological studies, like what's this like in the population? Like how many people suffer from PTSD and trauma and all sorts of other things. So this is quite interesting because you got a large scale sample of nearly 3,000 people. But now we would go, okay, I'm not surprised that people with PTSD have physical symptoms because you commonly see PTSD and physical symptoms to go together. You commonly see PTSD and anxiety and depression go together. And in fairness, PTSD is an anxiety disorder, so that would make sense. But here's the interesting thing, right? How have we moved on in the past 22 years? Have things got better? Is there more recognition of PTSD? Is there better treatment for PTSD? So let's check that out. To answer the question, I did an internet search and I tried to find the most recent survey of PTSD in the general population. I found one for the Irish population. And it turns out that about 8% of the Irish population have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. 8%. And I don't imagine it'd be too different in the UK and probably not in the US, given that about 6% of the British population would have a mental health problem. Okay, but what about with COVID? What effect does COVID have on it all? Because there is a relationship between COVID and PTSD. So I found a piece of research that was published in January 2022. Now, given that today is the 3rd of January, this is exactly 22 years later, really, from that first study in the Journal of Traumatic Stress. So if you think about COVID, well, it's actually a meta-analysis, which means it's analysis of all the kind of research that you could possibly find. So it's a systematic review and meta-analysis, and it's about all pandemics. And it has, thousands upon thousands and thousands of people. So they reviewed 1,238 papers. And there were 24,800 healthcare workers, 2,161 infected patients, and almost 177,000 of the general public. Now, here's the question. How many of those suffered from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which would then go on to be highly correlated with physical healthcare problems? Well, in the combined prevalence, like the whole lot, which is like virtually 200,000 people, 23% of people had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, there are associated healthcare problems. 27 to 29% of healthcare workers had these problems, and frontline workers, like ambulance, etc., 31%. So, given that we've got this current pandemic where, millions of people have died and millions of people have been infected, the likelihood of a significant number of people developing post-traumatic stress disorder is huge, highly correlated. And, papers before 2022 have suggested there's a significant relationship. So this stuff here, for instance, where for healthcare workers, there's like a 27% chance of having PTSD. That's a lot of people. And a lot of people are going to be having significant healthcare problems as a consequence of that. Now, the final piece of the puzzle is this. If you have treatment for PTSD, your healthcare problems diminish. Your physical health improves. So as you have treatment for PTSD, your psychological symptoms go down and your health improves. You have less headaches, less stomach upsets, less aches and pains, less dizziness, less, in a sense, the general symptoms of hyperanxiety. So I would suggest to you that in the 22 years since this journal was published, nothing has got better. I think waiting times are just as bad. The population, the general percentage of the population that struggle with PTSD has probably gone up, and certainly gone up since the pandemic. And services that treat PTSD have not gone up, have not kept pace. So actually, that's a pretty grim picture in my opinion. It's not really something that we should be proud of, because if you're burdened with physical symptoms because of a psychological problem, it's very hard to enjoy your life, and it's very hard to thrive, really. You can maybe push through and you can maybe get on despite having these problems, but it's hard to thrive, it's hard to be happy, and it's much easier to be depressed, generally anxious, and to have not quite the quality of life that you could want. So I hope you found this interesting. I'm going to throw this journal out now because I've extracted anything that's interesting for it, and I've got a little bit of space. So I'll keep looking for things to throw out, and I can buy some more books. Thanks for taking the time to watch and listen.